Is everyone round? Okay, perfect. Hi, and thank you so much for coming to Binary District event, Security and Stability for Blockchains, with our amazing speaker, Peter Todd. Before I go on to speak about Binary District, who we are and what we do, and we have our talk, I'd like to pass the mic over briefly to Ralph Manheim, the CEO of Primalbase, who have graciously hosted us today, and he'll say a couple words about Primalbase, and then I'll let you guys know a bit more about Binary District. So if you could give him a little round of applause as he comes on.
Thank you so much, Laura. First of all, welcome to Primalbase. I'm going to keep it very short because you're not here for me, but for our distinguished guest, Peter Todd. Welcome also on behalf of Primalbase. I want to have this moment to wish you a very, very fruitful evening and to learn a lot and to ask questions, to be interactive. And check us out and keep following us on Primalbase as we are the blockchain hub of all things that are online. We are the offline physical location for you to come work and prosper, I would say. So thank you very much. Over to you, and let's enjoy the evening.
Thank you. So, as you guys know, this is a Binary District event, and who we are. We are a community platform that produces courses and events on new and disruptive technologies. So, in a nutshell, we support and facilitate meaningful interactions between those with extensive knowledge of disruptive technologies and those looking to learn and upskill. So we are about promoting and fostering conversations between experts in various fields, including blockchain, VR, AI, and the community in various cities. So we have events in Amsterdam, Berlin, London, Moscow, and hopefully many more in the future. So our courses are on blockchain, VR, big data, cybersecurity, and events we've had so far have been our Genesis Moscow conference, blockchain hunts, blockchain hackathons, and various meetups. So we are very much focused on the technology aspect of it all. So these aren't promotional events and people, talking about big ideas of what they're going to do with its technologies that aren't realistic or aren't going to happen. They're about, discussing technology in a very real way and having genuine debates and discussion about them in a way that's going to advance the industry, because as we all know, these technologies are very much prone to misconception and just kind of a lot of exaggeration. So we want to rediscuss them and discuss how they can actually be implemented, because at the end of the day, technology is meant to serve a purpose and have a function. And if it doesn't, what is the point? So our upcoming meetups include Zero Knowledge Proof Protocols, which is in Moscow in Digital October, and we're going to have talks from Zuko Wilcox from Zcash and Alexander Cheponoy from Ergo Platform, and that is actually next week. So if any of you are going to be in Moscow next week, job by. Then on the 15th in London, we have blockchain for payment processing with Philip Jovanovic, who's a cryptographer based in Lausanne, and Louis Tuff, who is an engineer with Revolut. So those are our upcoming meetups. And our biggest event that we're having this year so far is going to be our Genesis London conference. We already had a Genesis Moscow conference last year in September, I want to say it was. Yeah, it was September. And that was a really, really great event with some amazing speakers who discussed blockchain, discussed their projects, what they're doing, and potential solutions in blockchain. So we have a short promotional video that's going to come up now. Yeah, so that was the Genesis conference in Moscow, and as you can tell, like, it was a really, really big event. It was really interesting, a lot of great speakers. It was a whole day event, so a whole day of meeting people from the Russian community, blockchain community, as well as the various speakers, and having really great discussions and conversations. So we hope to reproduce that in London and have something like that is just as good, if not better. So if you guys want to fly out to London, please go on our website and sign up there, and all the information will be on there, and a little bit more about it, actually. Thank you. Okay, so these are a few of the speakers that are going to be there. We have Eli Benterson, Jack Gavigan, Peter Todd, who's going to be there as well. Tim Ruffin, Ido Bentov, and many more speakers that are going to be announced. And the day is going to split into, well, it's going to split thematically. So it's going to be research and development, regulations, economics, and applications. So these are areas that we feel to be like the most pertinent and areas that really need to be discussed. And our speakers all have different perspectives on it. So I think that's really important in this space, because quite often it is pretty promotional and people are kind of trying to plug their products, but this is very much about the actual technology and how it can actually develop. So it's going to be very interesting to kind of hear all these people come together and see what they say. And finally, we're really proud that at the end of last year, we were able to launch our journal. We have some really great analytical articles about disruptive technologies, not just blockchain, but also biotech. We have some great articles on VR and AI, and all our sources come directly from experts, so we don't kind of take information from other articles already written. We actually speak to these experts and, you know, dissect what they say and use it to kind of discuss these technologies. And so we're all about debunking myths on disruptive technologies. So as I've said like a couple times already, there are a lot of misconceptions, so it's all about trying to dissect those misconceptions and find something that's actually productive and helpful and does something. So that is us. And I'm going to now pass the mic over to our moderator, Mix, and he's going to tell you a bit about himself, and then we're going to start the event. So thank you so much for listening to me, and hope you enjoy the day.
Thank you for having me. I also want to thank Binary District for letting me be a part of their wonderful community and also their efforts to take away the hype from blockchain and focus back on the technology. But before I get into it, I also want to tell you a bit more about myself and what I do. My name is Mix, and I work for a company called The Next Web. We're known for our flagship conference in Amsterdam, where we bring together 30,000 people over 2 days, but even more so for our news website, where I'm actually working as a technology journalist right now. And while I've previously focused on topics like internet culture and software security, I've recently been shifting my attention more and more towards cryptocurrency and blockchain. And the reason for that is because soon enough I'll be taking on a new role as the managing editor of TNW's new sub-brand called Hardfork, which will exclusively focus on bringing stories from the cryptocurrency and blockchain space, demystifying some of the myths behind that technology, and also explaining away some of the common misconceptions in this industry. And before I move on any further, I would also like to remind you to share your thoughts about tonight's event on social media with the hashtag Binary District, and to also check out the Genesis Block Conference, which has been fully supported by Blockchain Institute. So one of the reasons I'm really excited to be here tonight is because just like Binary District, and I assume like a lot of you people that came for this meetup, I have a genuine fascination with blockchain technology, not just the hype around it, but mostly the implications it could have for our future. And we all know what the hype is all about. Hype is not necessarily an inherently bad thing, But what is particularly bad about the hype around blockchain is that a lot of it has been centered around cryptocurrency, the price of cryptocurrency, the volatility of the market, and in general, money-related issues. We've all heard the stories about people getting ridiculously rich and spending lavishly their Bitcoin fortunes on Lamborghinis and a bunch of unnecessary luxuries nobody needs. And then we've also heard the other stories about gullible investors putting down their money and entire life savings into cryptocurrency projects that have basically bankrupted them. But it's also important sometimes to just, those topics are important, we should understand that, but it's also important to put these things aside for a second and focus on what has made this hype possible in the first place, which is the technology itself. And indeed, there's a lot of big names coming in the blockchain space, including governments and companies. For example, Russia and Estonia are currently looking into rolling out their own national digital currencies. Dubai, on the other hand, is looking into putting some of its public services on the blockchain too. And then at the same time, you have corporations like IBM, Microsoft, and Kodak openly experimenting with blockchain technology. But in the end, none of this is going to matter unless the technology can deliver on its promises. And a lot of these promises have to do with the security and the stability of blockchain. And funny enough, I often tend to say that some of the things about blockchain, some of the things that have been touted as blockchain's most disruptive features, such as its immutability aspects or the inability to reverse or change transactions post-fact on the blockchain. Also, the fact that also its implications for transparency, what its decentralized aspects could do for decentralizing authority in general and bringing power back in the hands of people. But also the ability to just make transactions online without necessarily having to attach your name or identity behind a wallet or an account. And the reason I mentioned that some of these things are often mentioned as interesting is the most interesting things about blockchain, and at the same time is because they've also been some of the most risky things about blockchain, at least in the public space. And to give you a fresh example from last week, actually last Friday, so it's technically less than a week, a well-known Japanese cryptocurrency exchange desk called CoinCheck was hacked, and attackers were able to go to take away nearly $530 million worth of cryptocurrency. Now, what is particularly interesting about this case is that CNN has already labeled the heist the biggest ever in the history of blockchain, surpassing the previous biggest one, which was the Mt. Gox breach back in 2014 when hackers made off with, I think, close to 400 million worth of Bitcoin. But what's interesting about this case is that yesterday Reuters reported there has been a development. And the company behind the stolen coins, which is NEM, they were able to apparently trace back the wallet, but since anyone can open a wallet on the blockchain and without necessarily attaching their name, they haven't been able to discover the real identities and location of the hackers. And at the same time, the hackers have been able to move these stolen funds to 6 different exchange desks where they can possibly exchange them for another currency, perhaps an anonymous one, Monero, I don't know, whatever your choice is, and then basically walk away with 530 million. Well, one thing that makes this better is that CoinCheck has since promised to reimburse its 260,000 affected investors, but the problem still remains. How can we avoid problems like that, and why are hackers targeting them? Well, recently in a study conducted by accounting giant Ernst & Young, researchers found that since due to the popularity of blockchain, hackers have been massively targeting cryptocurrency and initial coin offering projects. And the reason for that is because, as they say, hackers are attracted by the rush, absence of a centralized authority, blockchain transaction irreversibility, and information chaos. Project founders focus on attracting investors, and security is often not prioritized. Hackers successfully take advantage. The more hyped and large-scale the ICO, the more attractive it is for attacks. Both projects and investors are exposed to attacks. The most common types of attacks include substituting wallet addresses, accessing private keys, stealing funds from wallets, and stealing funds from exchange desks. Now, if you mention something, most of these problems happen not on the blockchain itself, but with third-party providers. So it's a weird conundrum, but it happens a lot. Just to give you an idea, back in December, a cryptocurrency mining marketplace known as NiceHash was also robbed of $60 million. Then a couple of weeks before that, a very controversial cryptocurrency known as Tether, you might have heard about that, it might be crashing the entire market, but anyhow, Tether was also robbed of 30 million. And just a couple of weeks before that, a very popular wallet solution for Ethereum called MyEther wallet suffered from a vulnerability, as a result of which an amount between 150 million and 280 million of funds were basically frozen on the Ethereum network. And users haven't been able to spend or use these funds since then. Now, if you're wondering how big the scale of that is, exactly, Ernst & Young in the same research concluded that out of the 4 billion poured into ICOs since last year, nearly 10% of the funds of that entire sum have gone either missing or have been stolen. Now imagine this, there's nearly 400 million of stolen and lost funds on the blockchain. Now that's obviously a huge problem, but it's not the only problem that blockchain technology is currently facing. On another note, we're also having, the technology is also experiencing problems with scalability and stability. And to give you a fresh example of that as well, and also a particularly entertaining one, if you remember back in December, there was a blockchain-powered game that launched, and it was called CryptoKitties. And I personally received the pitch and I turned it down because I didn't see anything special. But a lot of people thought it was special, and it went so big that eventually media outlets like TechCrunch, The Verge, we as well covered it after everyone else, but you get the point. Big media outlets like TechCrunch, The Verge, BBC, and also Vice covered the game, and the impact was so big, it was such a smash hit with users that it brought the entire Ethereum network to its knees. Following its launch, the Ethereum network received, I think, a 6-fold of unconfirmed transactions on its network, which made it extremely difficult to use. There was problems with transaction speed, transaction fees as well, a bunch of unconfirmed transactions that were just bounced back. And the problem with CryptoKitties is that it's not strictly limited to CryptoKitties or Ethereum. It happens on other blockchains too. Just to give you an example, earlier today I checked I checked out the unconfirmed transaction queues for the biggest leading blockchains, for the 2 biggest leading blockchains, which is obviously Ethereum and Bitcoin. And Ethereum had over 3,500 pending transactions at the time when I checked. Bitcoin was even worse, with 37,000 unconfirmed transactions. And now it's important to mention that a lot of these problems are being worked on by the blockchain community. Ethereum, for example, is working on moving to a new mining protocol known as proof of stake. And Bitcoin, which depends on proof of work, is working with the Lightning Network, which is hoping to bring a solution, an off-chain solution, which might speed up transactions and lower costs. But I'm not going to be talking about that more. I'd like to take a moment and hand the microphone to our main speaker. But before that, I want to remind you one more time, please let us know what you think about tonight's talks with the hashtag Binary District on social media, and check out the Binary District's Genesis conference. So without further ado, our next speaker is a Bitcoin developer. People call him a blockchain expert as well, but he prefers to be called an applied cryptography consultant. Please give a warm welcome to Peter Todd.
Thank you. Thanks. Yeah, so I'm Peter Todd. So by applied cryptography consultant, I'll just say, essentially, I'm the guy who actually goes and helps you figure out how to actually use this stuff. Much the same way as a plumber helps you figure out how to use all this fancy science of hydraulic engineering. And today I want to just go talk about, blockchain security. And by blockchain security, I mean, what does a blockchain do for security? And, why does this help you? And there you go. Of course, if you're going to talk about security, you might go ask, well, what is security in the first place? And, if in the movies, it's all about keeping bad guys out. And I'd probably be wearing a leather jacket and wearing some shades and maybe typing away really fast. But really, from a software development point of view, you can think of it as preventing bad things from happening. And the example I'll give is, imagine for writing, say, an image editor, like Photoshop. I'm trying to go help you do things you want to do. I'm trying to help you paste that picture of some strange actor onto some strange other movie that he wasn't in. Apparently that's a thing these days. Or maybe I'm helping you go and get the red eye out of your photo. Whatever it is, you're working in partnership with me, and I'm trying to go help you do the things you want to do. Whereas if I was writing security software, like maybe I'm writing a web browser and I'm writing the part that encrypts your connection to the bank. First and foremost, I'm thinking about, well, what am I trying to prevent from happening? Well, in that case, I'm trying to prevent the bad guys from reading the data going from you to your bank. This is actually really important because very frequently when we talk about security software, we don't talk about it in the right way. We talk about all these things we're trying to do, and we don't focus on, well, what exactly do you have to prevent to make that thing possible? And this actually comes up in thinking about traditional consensus. You may have heard of, say, Paxos or Raft or various other variations of these consensus algorithms. And your basic idea is, well, early in computing, you might have, say, one server, and that one server does something important. Maybe, runs the back end of a bank or something. And that all was well and good until, of course, people started noticing, well, servers aren't that reliable. So the next stage was they spent a ton of money on making servers very reliable. And you get some very interesting examples of this where, I think HP high reliability, if I remember correctly, was the right term. And, they had servers where they'd engineer them from the ground up to, say, have 3 power supplies and this, that, and the other. But ultimately, there's only so much you can go do to make an individual piece of hardware reliable. For starters, someone can go trip on the power switch, pull the plug out. And that hardware is expensive. So then you get consensus algorithms where they say, well, why can't we have, say, 5 different servers, and somehow they'll collectively come to consensus and figure out what is the right thing to do. And then you get Byzantine consensus where they say, well, what if the server that's failing could do absolutely anything? How can we still come to consensus under that circumstance? And, you get these fancy consensus algorithms. But notice how in all that discussion we're talking about coming to consensus. The interesting thing about traditional academic study on consensus is nowhere do they talk about what it should happen. They're not talking about the rule set. And also they're not talking about how do I convince someone else that consensus was reached. Why that matters is, well, I don't care if those 5 servers scattered across, 3 data centers at a bank come to consensus. I care what my actual device tells me. If I'm doing mobile banking, I want my device to tell me the right thing, to tell me what is the actual state of the consensus. If it says my balance is, $10,000, I want to know, is this really what my balance actually is? Is this what it will be in the future? I want to prevent that balance from getting into that state because, say, some sysadmin went and created 2 different transactions that, spent the same money, as an example. There's a lot of things that can go wrong here. Traditional consensus doesn't really address any of these. So then you get all this hype around blockchain, and there you go. And that, of course, makes you ask the question, well, what is a blockchain? Well, so earlier today I went and Googled it, and image search for blockchain, because I figured I'd get some clip art to go show you guys, and well, I can tell you that's a sphere. I think we probably live on it. That's another sphere. That's not even a chain of blocks. That's not a chain of blocks. In fact, in this entire thing, there isn't a single chain of blocks. So we'll try blockchain diagram. And again, half the stuff has nothing in relation to a chain of blocks. Which makes me wonder, what's really going on here? Well, I'll tell you very simply. It's that a whole bunch of marketers and other stuff fogged up the issue. A blockchain is a chain of blocks. End of story. And if you want a diagram of it, well, there you go. I drew that in about 30 seconds. All right, 1 minute, because I fiddled around with the thickness of the lines. So why all this hype around blockchains? Well, I mean, again, let's go back to what are we trying to prevent? If I can go verify the full set of data that led to some state, essentially replaying the algorithm that, say, something like Paxos or whatever would run, then I can figure out what happened, and I can verify what happened. And an example where this matters is, well, let's suppose we're trying to make some kind of system for tracking who owns what land. Now, in your traditional thing, I mean, maybe we'd submit transactions to the set of servers, and they'd do their Paxos thing, and they'd come back saying, all right, we agree that, Bob now owns this land. How do you know what actually happened? Well, let's come up with a simpler system where I say, suppose I own a house, and I want to go and sell it to Bob. So I sign a transaction, legally binding, saying, I owned this house, Bob now owns this house. You can verify that's true because you can go follow back to the point where we probably came in with a bunch of guns and stole the land from whoever used to have it. But we can agree on the accuracy of that, maybe not the truth of it, but you can say, all right, that's our chain of ownership. It leads up, now Bob owns that. Well, the problem here is, well, what if I simultaneously made a message saying, I'm going to go sell this house to Alice? The blockchain, if I do put all those messages that figure out who owns what in a chain of blocks, well, when you go verify the accuracy of this, you just work backwards from, start of it to the finish and say, well, did I try to sell this thing twice? That's really all there is to it. And because it's a chain of blocks, and everything that's supposed to be relevant to that should be in that chain, all you have to do is check, is there duplicate things that should not be in there? That's it. Yes, blockchains really are that simple. The only interesting question, once you have a chain of blocks, is, well, how do you decide which is the right chain? As after all, this is just data, right? I mean, if there's some mechanism by which I can say block, 10 is the blockchain, obviously there's a way for that mechanism to be repeated. In this case, I mean, what's the right one? Is it the blue one or is it the red one? And in a traditional sort of authority-based system, and Ripple, like or not, is an example of this, and various banking blockchains are an example of this. You have a set of authorities, and they can go sign off on what chain is true. Now, there may be some complex consensus algorithm, but ultimately it boils down to the question of who used their private keys to sign this statement saying this is the true chain. And in all these systems, well, there could be a duplicate. But if that doesn't happen, the system works, right? So from a security point of view, well, what did we really prevent? Well, we said that assuming that they don't sign twice, you will get this property. And assuming that you can find out that they've signed twice, you'll get this other property where you now know that, hey, there's two different contradictory histories. Obviously something went wrong. I don't know, maybe contact your local journalist or something. But within the system, I mean, there is no solution here. This is where the security broke. And your real problem is, so let's look at that scenario, right? In this slide, I'm assuming you somehow learned that there are two alternate histories. But that isn't necessarily easy to do. I mean, if I'm trying to go sell you a house and then sell him a house, well, if I can control their respective ability to get information, maybe because I, happen to be their ISP, or I go and pay off someone who's in their ISP, their computer may never learn about that other history. You may never learn that the red blockchain exists. Or when you do learn, it may be too late, and you might have already transferred me the money for this new house. And that's a major problem. And there is no direct mechanism in these trust-based blockchains to solve that. So then let's look at proof of work. I mean, you've probably heard that Bitcoin miners, they destroy energy and they somehow validate blocks and so on and so forth. Most of those explanations are, frankly, kind of bullshit. And I won't be very polite about that, but that's the truth of it. First of all, miners don't validate. They may validate for their own purposes, but you're the one doing the validation. You're the one checking it. But the more interesting thing, though, is let's go ask from the perspective of security again. You know, what are we trying to prevent? Well, can we make this attack where someone prevents you from knowing about this contradictory blockchain expensive? So imagine if you're in this scenario, right? I send you some money. You see the previous blockchains, you know, blocks that you know about in the chain. You see a block containing your transaction. And you see a bunch of confirmations on top of it. So what has proof of work proved? Well, it's proved that a bunch of work was done to confirm that transaction. And what that prevents is from someone undoing that transaction without spending a lot of money. Now, come on, there you go. Now, that's not to say it's impossible. You know, maybe what actually happened was after, 4 confirmations, you suddenly learn about a longer chain. A chain with more total work. Well, in the rules of proof of work consensus, this is now the chain that's valid, and that chain is now relevant from your perspective. From people who still only know about this chain, I mean, that's all they know about, so they'll think that's a valid chain. But once you learn about that other chain, your node will go switch and say, hey, that money that you thought you received is no longer valid. But remember, we still prevented you from thinking that you had received that money, thinking that that transaction has gone through, without at least the bad guy having to somehow spend a whole bunch of money creating all these new blocks. So we're still doing better than the trusted case. And it's kind of a subtle difference there. Similarly, I could always go do both. I mean, you could imagine a system where we had a set of central authorities, and they were supposed to go sign what the correct chain was, and on top of that, a bunch of work was done to make it difficult to go and undo a transaction. And while this is a bit of an advanced topic, I mean, you can also take chains that work that way and anchor them into proof of work chains like Bitcoin to essentially get the best of both worlds. So I could do a whole another 30-minute talk on that. But the important thing to take away from here is what this proof of work security does, and it provably makes it expensive to change history. Simple as that. And it actually is a little better than that, because in my previous slide, what I actually showed wasn't quite what was likely to happen. Now, I showed a bunch of confirmations. They kind of came at a regular interval, and I showed, a reorg with a bunch of other confirmations. Now, one of the assumptions you can make, especially with things that use ASICs, is chances are all the available hardware to actually mine blocks is at any moment going to be used to go mine blocks. After all, it's profitable, so why wouldn't you go plug something in and start using it? So in reality, in many scenarios, like suppose someone hacks into a mining pool and starts using it to try to double spend people. Well, you can detect this because you'll suddenly notice, hang on a second, hash rate just dropped and suddenly my blocks are taking a long time to arrive. In this scenario, I might say, well, hang on, I should have had like 3 blocks with, say, 75% probability between when I received my transaction and when I thought I'd gotten the last block. So that should be telling your client something. Hang on a second, maybe you don't actually know about the most work chain. Similarly, when you get a confirmation, if this confirmation happens significantly later than you would expect, that's additional information. And each additional confirmation that comes later than you would expect should be telling your client something. Maybe you're not actually seeing the most work chain. Now, I'll be honest, I've never seen a wallet actually implement this properly. In theory, you can do this, and it could be a very powerful security thing, but the reality is no one does this. But at least it's there, and it provides a very interesting benefit, which is you do have very strong what's called Sybil attack resistance. Even if someone's trying to control your internet connection entirely, it's very difficult for them to convince you that what you're seeing is the real chain. Now, if you're only relying on, say, 1 or 2 confirmations, I'm sorry, this isn't going to help you very much. But for very high-value stuff where people are relying on many more confirmations, this is a very useful technique. And in theory, it can provide a lot of benefits. And then I'll go ask, well, all right, so I took this from a very simple level, what exactly does this do? But you've probably heard, well, Bitcoin proof of work systems, they have incentives, miners have incentives to mine things, they're incentivized by the economics to do the right thing, et cetera, et cetera. So you might ask the question, well, does any of this matter? And I'll actually say to a first approximation, no. Everything I told you about it's provably expensive to reverse a transaction is true no matter what miners do. We don't actually care what their incentives are at that level of analysis. Even if 100% of miners are malicious, they still, because this is energy, they must go and destroy that energy to do that work, to reverse that block. And there is no way getting around this. And that's a very different model than, say, a trusted system where you just go sign blocks. And I don't know, maybe there's a legal consequence, maybe there isn't. Proof of stake, which again is sort of a whole other topic. But it's a similar type of logic where, in theory, in sort of slasher-style proof of stake, doing the wrong thing will get you punished, but it's not 100% clear. I mean, would that really happen? In all scenarios, no, not necessarily. Proof of work has this very provable, simple thing, which is interesting. Not necessarily the right solution, but it's interesting that it's true. On the other hand, if you want to go look at maybe the next level of incentives, what if you care about who controls the system? What if you care about censorship resistance? What if you want to ensure that the people doing this work usually will go behave in certain ways? Well, that's where, of course, economics gets very interesting. This is where you get to go talk about things like block size. Does a bigger block size or smaller block size, who is able to effectively compete and make money in mining? And that gets questions, well, how do we make, say, a pie chart like this have more entities on it? Right now, in theory, in the short run, there's like 3 different computers, roughly speaking, who could probably have the ability to, in the short run, control Bitcoin, and do a reorg attack. Now, does it stay that way? I mean, would that be true if they did this once? I mean, it gets very, very complex. As an example, when you look at something like, say, BTC.com, they're not a single entity. They don't actually own that hardware directly. So it's not like you can just go and ask them to go and do some attack on Bitcoin. But you certainly can in the short term. And again, this gets kind of complex to exactly what these incentives are. This is where you got to be thinking in terms of your economics design about how do you ensure that miners of different size and different investment end up being able to earn the same returns. A good example being, if I can earn far more money per dollar invested at a bigger scale than a small scale, well, obviously this blue part of the pie chart is going to get bigger over time because they can reinvest their earnings. Whereas the smaller part, they're going to lose out. That's a typical thing you see in economics, and there's a whole bunch of interesting discussions to be had there. Finally, I'll just talk a little bit about, well, where are we going in the future? And I think in terms of blockchain security, the really interesting thing is this move to reactive security. Currently in Bitcoin, and I think most reasonable currencies as well, people are looking at the Lightning protocol to do transactions cheaper. And, well, how does Lightning actually work under the hood? Well, to simplify, it's based on bidirectional payment channels. The idea is that if I want to send money to Alice, we can get together and sign a transaction, or get together and create a transaction that sends money to coins that we jointly control. And then when I want to go and pay her a bit of that, I just give her a signed transaction that she can get mined to take a bit more of that pot of money, and then give the rest back to me. And every time I give her a little more, I'm giving her an option to take a little more of that money. When we want it to go the other way, I ask her to put herself in a position where if she took that full amount, I could then steal it back from her. Now, that's the critical thing. There's two parts of this where I can go and do something to punish the other party for not doing the right thing. In particular, the taking the money back if they take more of that pot than they're allowed. But that's a reactive measure. The context of reactive measures, well, with proof of work, it was all passive. Once I got my transaction in, work would just accumulate. And nothing I did had any impact on that. Whereas in a reactive thing, unless you respond in time to the bad thing the bad guy does, they get away with it scot-free. And it's important to note how different a security model that is. It's censorship, as an example, becomes an issue. And, this pie chart becomes a much more important thing. And I'll say, quite frankly, that with Lightning, if miners collude with operators of Lightning channels, they can steal money. That's a simple fact. Whereas with normal proof of work transactions, they can only steal money by spending a ton of money. There's your kind of difference in security model. Similarly, in proof of stake models, many of them have these same kind of reactive notions where if you create two chains and you shouldn't have, you get punished in some way. But punishment's a reactive thing. It's not an inherent thing. So with that, let's get some questions.
One more time,
Sure.
so I fully grasp that concept.
So I'll
it sounds pretty important.
Give an example with you. So if I want to go send money to you, and I could just go and create a transaction and just get it mined, and that would give you that money. But if I might want to do this, say, 10,000 times, obviously 10,000 transactions is a bit of a waste. Right? Suppose I'm buying Wi-Fi off of you, and we want to go pay per byte. We're not going to do a one transaction per byte. So I can get nearly the same thing by instead giving you the option to take progressively large amounts of money from me. And the way we can do this is by putting the money into a shared multi-sig where I control it and she controls it jointly. And every time I pay her, I'm writing a transaction, spending some of that multi-sig, giving some of it to her, and then giving the rest back to me. Yes, yeah, it's an escrow between the two of us. And I'm giving you options to take an increasingly large amount of that money. Now, obviously, you could voluntarily take the smallest amount. You could even just give it all back to me. But it's in your incentive to take the largest amount that you have access to, which in a single directional payment channel is simply the most recent transaction, because the amount always goes up. So the clever thing Lightning does is they make it bidirectional by making a mechanism by which you can you can give me the ability to take the money back if you try to mine some set of transactions. And suppose we call these sequence numbers. We say, well, everything after sequence number 10,000, if you get that mined, I now have the technical ability to create a third transaction that takes that money and then gives it all back to me. So I'm reacting to you doing that fraudulent thing. And that's the rub. I have to react. You can still attempt to do this, If I get my transaction mined, I'll probably, take the money back. But it is still technically possible for you to take my money, for you to go defraud me. And this becomes plausible when, for instance, you're in cahoots with the miners and you say, all right, I will take that money and I will prevent Peter from getting his money back and thus, punishing me by preventing the, anti-fraud transaction from ever getting mined. And if it never gets mined, I'm just out. I've lost my money. And that's why Lightning is reactive, because you must react to that fraud, right? Whereas proof of work, certainly you can reverse it by doing a reorg, but that's always expensive, and that will only get more expensive over time.
Okay. Now we're going to have a fireside chat, and then we can come back to the questions.
Sure.
So one of the things that we spoke about just before the event was that you have a background in fine arts as well, in addition to cryptography. And since I assume that a lot of the people that came to this meeting also have different backgrounds, not necessarily in blockchain, I was wondering, do you have any advice for people who come from different backgrounds, how they can leverage those backgrounds to maybe give new insight on cryptography once they get invested into cryptography or blockchain?
Well, so I think something I'd point out is I don't have a background in cryptography per se. What I have a background is how to go use cryptography. And, the difference of that is, cryptography, you can, the technical term is to sort of black box it, which is to say, suppose we have a hash function. You don't need to know how the hash function does what it does to go use it. What you need to understand is what it does and what the properties are. What actually does sort of under the hood isn't very relevant. When you go drive a car, do you know exactly how the car works? No. Do you know what properties it has? What pedals you should go push? What's your max acceleration, so on? Yes. And depending on, what type of driving you're doing, you may know more and more and more. But even, a Hollywood stunt driver, they're not going to know exactly how the timing system on their car works down to the detail of the microprocessor involved. For that matter, the engineers who built it, they're not going to know how the microprocessors work. This is always true in engineering. You always find some level of abstraction, and you make things under that level of abstraction a black box. And this is possible in cryptography basically because things like hash functions and other primitives are very well understood. So the things I need to know, say about SHA-256, are a relatively short list. Because earlier hash functions, which had flaws in them, well, they've gotten rid of those flaws and they made what you need to know to use it effectively a much smaller list of things. So really, my advice there would be figure out what level of abstraction you think you can learn at and figure out how to do something novel. The second part's kind of hard. There aren't really simple answers to that, but, read things and learn things and try to think of new things.
Thank you for that. Does anybody have any questions with regards to this? We have two. I'd like to give you the microphone.
I'm a lawyer, and basically I study space law and aviation law. So these days we are seeing a lot that after commercial use of space, many people are saying that Bitcoin or blockchain can be used as a space currency for using it as paying for space work. So do you really think that? Because from a legal perspective, we feel that it can violate some fiscal laws or some privacy laws. But do you really think that Bitcoin can be used for paying transactions in space? Because I don't know.
I actually did a talk very closely related to this, which was what would happen if people started trying to mine Bitcoin in space? And the interesting thing about this is, well, space is very big. And it's so big that the speed of light's kind of slow in comparison. So in low Earth orbit, you communicate to even geostationary, and if I remember correctly, the number is like 0.3 seconds or so round trip. But the moment you get out of that, from here to Mars is, if I remember correctly, like 10 minutes or so round trip on average. Well, that's long enough that your ability to be in consensus with Bitcoin is getting reduced. So you don't actually know what the status of the Bitcoin network is because you're too far away from it. And the further out you go, the less you actually know. So, to kind of answer your question, I mean, certainly like anything, on one level, yeah, you can go make payments. I mean, it's just information going around. But funny enough, no, you can't actually participate fully. And it actually causes big problems because if, we get to like a sci-fi, near future sci-fi world where people are off running satellites, powered mining farms, orbiting, say, the sun, at some fairly close distance, yeah, all of Bitcoin kind of gets screwed up because now other parts of the solar system can't be in consensus. And the irony of all this is that a decentralized consensus system can only work if it's centralized. Because you can't be in consensus unless you can communicate with each other. And unless you're sufficiently centralized to be in the same kind of light cone, the same sphere of, well, what's the round trip distance by the speed of light, you cannot be in consensus.
Also, you get extra points for an excellent question. There was a question from there. You still want to ask it? Perfect.
No, it was the same question he had. Hey, Peter, thanks for the talk. I hope it was recorded because it's a lot to take in. Going back to the Lightning Network and Alice and Bob example, so they set up a common payment channel and they transact regularly. So they put the funds in a common pool and they update the state every time they transact and stuff. In real life, that would be, in my opinion, kind of create a problem for liquidity because essentially what you have is that these funds are blocked in this common pool. Is that the case, or can you elaborate on that and tell us if it's even a problem?
Yeah, well, what the Lightning Protocol actually does, rather than my kind of very simplified example, is to take these payment channels and then create them into a mesh network. So, that gives much less of a liquidity problem, essentially, because I can use that money that I put in these channels for any purpose, for anyone that's connected in that mesh. And liquidity is a problem when you don't have access to money to do something that you want to do with it. Well, if most of what you want to do is pay people using Lightning, the fact that it's locked up in a channel is completely irrelevant. Equally, if you have cooperation with the people you have channels open with, you can always, just as fast as any other Bitcoin transaction, close out the channel and use that money to also pay someone. And this can be done, instantly. I mean, if I have a channel with, say, you, and we're in a position where out of, say, the, 1 Bitcoin, we have dedicated that channel. Admittedly, maybe a lower example I should use, like, say, a tenth of a Bitcoin given local price. But we'll say 1 for a point of argument. With that 1, if out of that I currently owe you half of it, and then I want to go pay him, say, a quarter of it, well, we can close that, and in that same transaction, pay you the half, and then pay him the quarter, and simultaneously open a new channel with the remaining quarter. And that's just as fast as any transaction. The problem is, of course, if she doesn't cooperate, then you've got to go through this whole longer process of closing it in an uncooperative way, which is, I do a transaction that closes it. She then has the ability to rebut me if she knows that I'm not closing with the right channel, not closing with the right amount being paid to her, and so on. That has associated timeouts and so on. So long story short, I mean, a safe implementation would probably, that could end up being, say, a week of the money getting tied up. And the figure of 1 week comes out of, well, if something goes wrong, we want to ensure that there is sufficient time to react so that you don't get defrauded of your money by a temporary issue with responding. This creates tough problems. But if you're with entities that are cooperative, then then this stuff's really a big issue, and it's certainly safer than, say, keeping your coins on an exchange. Miles safer than that.
I think we have time for one more question, but before that, I wanted to remind you that Binary District is doing a game where you can drop off your business card for a chance to win a spot at the Genesis conference. So when the person with the special container for the business card comes, please drop your business card if you brought it, and don't double dip. Who wants to have the last question? Okay, let's have 3 questions. Okay, so we can have 3 questions. Let's go with you first.
So regarding to proof of work and security, I would say that Bitcoin is currently the most secure cryptocurrency out there, but the security is also directly tied to its costs in energy use and money, in a sense. Do you think in the current Bitcoin development it's possible to really disconnect energy use and security from each other, or would it be too difficult because it would be too easy to provide enough computing power to perform a 51% attack?
Yeah, I'd say it's definitely impossible for the simple reason that so long as, I mean, the idea of proof of work is to be expensive. You know, simple as that. And in any system, if you need to make something expensive and then you try to go make it expensive in a different way other than energy use, you know, the economics of it will go and optimize things to the point where it's now the expense is energy use. You know, a good example being, I mean, let's suppose you want, you know, hypothetical proof of space ASIC, where the cost is supposed to be limited access to, say, large amounts of memory. Well, I mean, what are the costs of creating a large amount of memory? You know, it might not look like energy. You go buy this thing off the shelf and then you use no energy to go run it. But where, you know, how did that memory come into existence? Well, someone spent a whole lot of energy taking a bunch of silicon out of the ground and refining it, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You know, ultimately, that's still going to be an energy use. In fact, it may be worse energy use from certain perspectives, like, say, CO2 emission. Because in, you know, say an ASIC, I mean, how do I go be profitable mining an energy-intensive ASIC? Well, I go find very cheap energy, and as it happens to be, the very, very cheapest energy out there tends to be things like stranded hydro, you know, hydroelectricity dams that were built in places too far away from the grid to easily take that power and move it somewhere more valuable. Now, it's not simple enough to say that's necessarily low CO2 production, because in theory, I mean, that energy could have been used to offset other energy usage. But it's not as simple as to say, well, that's bad, you know, high energy usage and this other thing's low energy. I mean, it all kind of ends up converging anyway. From the point of view, well, we want to have a system that is secure. I mean, what you really want is for everyone to use the same proof of work system. You know, and the reason why is, well, let's look at the attack model. I mean, again, what are you trying to prevent? You're trying to prevent a guy from doing a reorg of a chain to gain some benefit. You know, we prevent that by making it expensive. Well, if I'm an attacker and I want to reorg your transaction, but every single person in this room is paying into security for that same chain, I have to attack everyone even though all I could benefit from was to attack that one guy. Now maybe I can attack, you know, 3 of you at once, right? I do a transaction for 3 of you at once. Maybe I can attack 4 of you at once. But can I really attack all of you at once and get steal money from everyone at once? In most cases, that's very difficult to go do. So if everyone uses the same chain, you're all contributing security, yet I can't attack you all at once. You know, by pooling your resources together, you will win that battle. You know, unfortunately, it turns out for essentially any use case, you know, well, I shouldn't say any use case, but nearly any use case, especially, you know, fintech type stuff, you can always anchor a chain to another proof of work chain. And I even got an example, I posted Bitcoin Dev mailing list a few weeks ago showing how for token transfer applications, it was easy to come up with systems that were, you know, infinitely scalable. You know, an example I gave was something that did 500,000 transactions per second, that required about 10 megabytes per year proofs, and was trustless with respect to validation and then trusted with respect to censorship resistance. Long story short is if you're a bank and want to go move money around and want to prove to your clients that money was moved accurately and honestly, you can do all this and have it anchored to Bitcoin. And you can scale as big as you want, and that's just not that hard to do. So yeah, I wouldn't put too much effort in changing proof of work. I'd put more effort into figuring out how can we just reuse the energy wasted already.
Two more questions. There was questions in the middle. Okay, let's go with you. Can someone pass the mic?
Yeah, otherwise if you can hear me. We prefer the Hi. Can you share your opinion on the delegate proof of stake consensus algorithm, and what do you think of the use case might be if not for a public chain, and what are your concerns about it?
Well, I think an important thing to point out, first of all, is a lot of people have made the claim that proof of stake scales better, and that's simply not true. You know, the reason why these systems don't scale is because anyone who wants to fully validate has to have the entire chain. You know, that's true regardless of how you actually come to consensus. Equally, when you have ways of improving on that with, say, sharding and so on, those systems work regardless of how you come to consensus. So that's not actually, you know, an issue here. You know, the claim, I think, for proof of stake is a much simpler one, which is it should be cheaper. But, of course, then, you know, any of these systems, I mean, at least the secure ones like slashing-based systems, well, one of the things they have to do is tie up money. Because if the money isn't tied up, the incentives don't work properly. Well, tying up money economically is also expensive. I mean, this is why banks in theory are supposed to pay you interest. You know, because you have money tied up that you can't use, so you should get paid for that. Of course, there's whole other issues with banking system, which makes that kind of fairy tale story something you'll tell to your kids, but in theory, that's how it's supposed to go work. And at least for your business, you certainly will want to get paid for having a bunch of your capital tied up. Now, at a tech level, I mean, the delegation part of delegated proof of stake, that's not terribly interesting. I mean, it's just a way of delegating someone else to actually go sign something. You know, and you still, to have a secure system, need these coins be frozen. The reason why you need it frozen is these nothing at stake attacks, which is simply, well, you know, in my diagrams, you know, I constantly show how you could have two chains. Well, what prevents the two chains? In a pure proof of stake system where it's simply you go sign a statement saying, I think the chain should be this, there's nothing directly preventing me from signing 100 different statements that are all contradict with each other. Or, you know, grinding through these possible possibilities, figure out, well, if I do this in the future, how do I get a benefit from this? What the slasher systems try to do is they try to say, if we catch you signing two alternate stakes, then we will have that as evidence that your coins tied up are now, you know, say destroyed or say given to someone else or whatever. But systems like that, well, they still have this sort of meta level problem of, well, how do you figure out when an event like that happened? How do you figure out that it actually did? You know, what prevents you from not learning about, for instance, that this has happened? Well, you hope that you find a sort of common consensus prior to the point where any of these shenanigans might have happened. But that's actually a centralized trust issue. You know, it's a bootstrapping problem. And these systems create very severe bootstrapping problems because you can't just say, you know, run your node and look at blocks and it, you know, figure out, well, someone obviously burned, you know, $10 million worth of electricity. Chances are the amount of money they spent really was, say, 10 million and not some piddly amount. Therefore, I should go trust the chain. I don't need to check further. You know, there's a lot of human intervention in when you don't have this sort of ground truth. Okay. So, long story short is, I think it's a very open security question, and I wouldn't trust these systems very much.
Okay, we took a question from the right side, from the center, and now one from the left side. The person closest to the left, I was going to say, so that's you.
Howdy.
Hi, everyone. I'm Chris DeRose, old friend. Good to see you. So in light of the forks that we're seeing in Bitcoin right now and the crises that we had last year with Bitcoin Cash and Bitcoin Core, or whatever you want to name it, what are your feelings on governance in 2018? Do you think that is a developer's concern? Do you think that's interesting? Can you talk a bit about what your feelings are on that particular issue in blockchain, if you have developed those?
Well, I think the important thing about governance is different people have different needs. You know, if we're talking about, say, a fintech banking chain, you know, I might take the point of view that we want very, very tight governance to, for instance, be able to reverse transactions quickly. You know, like, I mean, when you were talking earlier about all the thefts that were happened, you know, all I was thinking about is, well, in a traditional financial system, none of this would be an issue because we just reverse all these thefts. And they wouldn't even happen in the first place because any thief would know that their effort would be wasted because the money would just get taken back. You know, and that's a type of governance that many people want. And in that type of governance, well, you know, you want a very active governance process to come to consensus, to reverse transactions, and you want it human-oriented, and you probably want the people involved to be known, and so on. You know, and that's a valid design choice. It's not a particularly interesting type of system, but, you know, some people need this. And other issues of governance, you know, include trying to go figure out, well, how do you know, mitigate conflicting needs? I mean, the simple reality is decentralization with the current schemes available and cost per transaction are opposed to each other. You know, if you want to have on-chain transactions and you want them to be cheap, you must have a system that is nowhere near as trustworthy and censorship resistance and so on. I mean, it's just inherent conflict. Better tech will change this, of course, but we have to live with what we have, and they're in conflict right now. So you're definitely going to get governance there. And I think from the point of view of the other extreme of people who say, well, I want to know what I invested in, I want it to be stable, and I want to have the same properties it had yesterday to have today. You know, what we've seen with Bitcoin is it is possible to engineer systems that do not need major changes. You know, and frankly, like after SegWit, it would be very easy for nothing to happen for the Bitcoin protocol and to not really be a big deal. I mean, there's a whole laundry list of stuff developers want, but let's face it, you know, they're all nice things to have. None of them are really that essential. And arguably, you could have gone away without SegWit too. But, you know, we had a process by which getting these changes in that would change things about Bitcoin. They were very difficult to do. Thus, your investment had roughly the same properties as it did yesterday, and some people were going to want that. So from that perspective, yeah, I think the governance process in Bitcoin was spectacularly successful. It deterred many different people trying to go change Bitcoin for what it was. And for people who didn't want to buy into that, they also had options. You know, if you want something different, well, great, buy some Bcash. If you want to go call it something different, go right ahead, too. I can go call it what I want. You know, equally, if you want something which has very tight levels of top-down control, well, you probably want to go buy some Ripple. In fact, you probably want to ignore this stuff entirely and partner with, say, R3 and just build some fancy auditable database with a blockchain attached that does exactly what you want. You know, or if you need something a little less, I mean, maybe use my open timestamp stuff, which there isn't even a governance question because you use it for what you want to do for your own purpose, and that's that. You know, I mean, this is why all the tech I write, you know, the code I do, my usual thinking is, well, how do I use the system without changing it at all for my own purpose? This is why open timestamps is downright censorship resistant. It's very, very difficult for someone to prevent open timestamps from existing on their chain. You know, you can't block it. My work on single-use seals with Proof Marshal, exact same story. Trying to prevent someone from using your chain with, you know, my Proof Marshal protocol work is very difficult. Thus, there isn't a governance issue. They get to do what they want, and no one else can go stop them. And if they want to collect, you know, voluntarily let someone else have control over them, that's fine, but they get to choose. And I'd say that's a great outcome for governance.
So I guess that sums it up. I'd like to thank you all on behalf of Binary District for being here with us tonight and for participating in this event. Now I'd like to invite you to network with each other over some... Oh yeah, also to do the business card thing first, and then we can network over some lovely beverages. You can... You can totally double dip, by the way. I was just kidding the first time.
So as you'll see in a moment, she'll go and put the hash fit on the blockchain and then wait for the next block to select it.
It's going to take about 10 minutes.
I'm not sure how trustworthy I am, but let's see.
It's our guy, the one with the many business cards. We do 2 more? Perfect.
All right.
It's a ticket to the Kinesis conference, by the way, in London. So, get a ticket now.
Oscar, from Colombia.
Oscar, yeah. Right. Congratulations.
That's not
So
suspicious
Oscar is
at
also
all.
joining you in London.
And Albert Tressens from the Netherlands.
There we go. Congratulations.
And we do a t-shirt.
And we also have a t-shirt to give out. So now Peter is going to draw one of these for the winner of the t-shirt. Only one.
Wait, what do you want me to do?
You just get one of these, and then whoever you chose wins a t-shirt.
All right, so Anna Dietrich.
Who is Anna? Over there. So you get a t-shirt, Anna.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.